we're going to dive straight in with our main story this week, which concerns murder. You know, the thing that cats are constantly plotting. Cats only want two things: fancy feast chicken pâté and the slow, painful death of their enemies. Murder is also, in a sense, what this singer did to the national anthem last year during an election debate for third-party candidates.
And the rockets, red girl. I fucked it up. Can I go back? Can I go back, please? A bomb bursting, and then I got too nervous. Gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Whoa, say does that star-spangled
Excellent. Rest in peace to the national anthem. Now, was that tough to watch? Yes, it was. But does the fact that Jill Stein had to stand there listening to it make it a little better? Abso-fucking-lutely. Now, specifically, this story concerns something called felony murder, which I know sounds redundant. After all, aren't all murders technically felonies? But it's a particular type of charge, as this local news segment chose to explain with some odd framing.
Felony murder is not the pre-planned, made-for-TV murder you might be thinking. So, WTF is felony murder? Well, felony murder allows anyone involved in a dangerous crime to be charged with murder if someone is killed during that crime. So even if the person didn't actually kill someone, they can still get charged. So let's say you're the getaway car driver for a bank robbery, and your accomplice panics and kills the bank teller. You can be charged with murder without even stepping into the bank building or having a gun or pulling the trigger.
That is honestly a pretty good explanation, albeit with a very distracting intro. What is that? You're talking about a murder charge here. Why go with wacky graphics and music that sound like a circus clown's alarm clock? Now, if you're talking about something boring like escrow, sure, goof it up to the max, but not if the subject is serious. The last thing any viewer wants to see is that graphic, followed by a reporter saying, so, WTF is the age of consent. But to reiterate, felony murder is basically a felony plus a death equals a murder charge, even if you didn't intend to kill anyone and even if you are not the one who did the killing. And as you'll see, these charges can go way further than just getaway drivers in bank robberies because, crucially, you don't have to be an active participant in a killing to get charged with felony murder. You don't even have to be anywhere near it. Take what happened when these four men broke into a house in Florida to steal a safe. When someone there tried to stop them, one of them beat her to death. But under felony murder, all four were charged with her killing, as well as this guy. And I'll let him explain why.
I'm in prison because I loaned my keys to my roommate.
It was 2003, the morning after a party at his house in Pensacola.
He said, "Can I borrow your keys to your car?" And I said, "Sure."
He went back to sleep. Holly says when he woke up and his car wasn't back, he called his roommate, who said they were about to break in.
If I would have really have taken it serious, I would have called the police.
But under Florida's felony murder rule, Holly was just as responsible as the man who killed Snyder. Holly, like the other four men, was sentenced to life without parole.
Yeah, he was sentenced to life for a murder that took place over a mile away that he didn't know was going to happen and where his involvement was limited to lending his car for the burglary. It's enough to make you ask, what the fuck? Oh, no, sorry, no, I actually don't need those graphics. I'm an adult being upset, not a clown juggling bowling pins. And the thing about felony murder is, it's actually much easier for a prosecutor to obtain a conviction under it than under a standard first-degree murder charge where they have to prove the defendant intended to kill. Because under felony murder, all they have to prove is someone committed or aided in a felony that led to a death. And if you're convicted, judges can have little discretion on sentencing. In fact, 11 states in the federal system mandate life without parole for all felony murder convictions, while these states mandate it in at least some cases. And around half of US states allow death sentences for unintentional killings under felony murder laws. In fact, since 1985, 11 people have been executed for participating in a felony during which a co-defendant committed homicide. That is 11 people executed for murder despite not killing anyone. And look, I oppose the death penalty in all cases, but we clearly shouldn't be executing people for murder if they did not murder someone. You can actually find more tips like that in my new law textbook, A Practical Guide to the Most Obvious Shit You've Ever Heard. And while nobody keeps stats on felony murder convictions nationwide, in the states where they do exist, the numbers are astonishing. In Pennsylvania and Michigan, 1/4 of people serving life without parole there were convicted of felony murder. That's over 1,000 in each state. And approximately half of California's prisoners serving life without parole were convicted of felony murder. And while in some of those cases, prosecutors were simply using the charge as an easier way to get a conviction for someone who did actually commit the murder, in many, many others, they weren't. In fact, a study in New York State found that half of those convicted and punished for felony murder were not proven to have killed anyone. So given all that, tonight, let's talk about felony murder. And let's start with its origins, because like so many horrid things in American culture, it actually came from England. The idea began being applied in British courts in the late 18th century, but in 1957, England abolished its version of felony murder, and other common law countries like India and Canada followed suit, except America. Instead, it's doubled down and hard. In fact, in its current form, felony murder has been called a distinctly American innovation, or as the Michigan Supreme Court described it, a historic survival for which there is no logical or practical basis for existence in modern law. And look, if we're going to keep weird old laws on the books, let's at least keep the fun ones. Like the 1971 Minnesota statute that says, and this is true, no person shall operate, run or participate in a contest, game or other like activity in which a pig, greased, oiled or otherwise, is released and wherein the object is the capture of the pig. Those words were written and voted on by lawmakers, and I think my favourite part is the phrase, a pig greased, oiled or otherwise. Because they knew if grease and oil were off the table, by God, someone would figure out another way to make a pig slippery. Now, there are some state variations. For instance, these limit felony murder charges to killings by participants in the felony, but these only require what is called proximate cause, which means they allow felony murder convictions when non-participants in the underlying crime do the killing. And that can lead to cases like what happened in Elkhart, Indiana, when a group of 5 unarmed young men, 4 of them teens, broke into a house in the afternoon to burglarise it, believing no one was at home at the time. Now, unfortunately, the homeowner was actually asleep upstairs, and he grabbed his handgun, came downstairs, and began firing his weapon, killing one of them. Now, the 4 teens survived, only to then be charged with felony murder in the death of their friend, which they still cannot quite believe.
I didn't really comprehend it. I didn't put my mind around what I was really about to go through. To me, we all should be charged for what we done that day, but nobody committed murder, so why should we be charged with it?
I committed burglary, you know. Serious things did happen. Denzel's gone, you know. I mean, I'm not saying I don't deserve time.
The trial lasted just 4 days. The teenagers were all found guilty of an adult crime. 17-year-old Levi was sentenced to 50 years in prison. 16-year-old Blake and 18-year-old Anthony Sharp each got 55 years.
Look, I know they started things by trying to rob the house, but it's a bit of a stretch to go from that to 5 decades in prison for a killing that someone else committed. At a certain point, assigning an outcome to a chain of causation no longer makes sense. It is why, when the Oscar for Best Actor was awarded last year, it was given to Cillian Murphy and not to his parents, whose hot Irish sex led to his existence. The fact is, felony murder can be applied in an astonishingly broad array of circumstances. There are stories of people being charged with it after doing drugs next to friends who OD'd, or in the wake of a robbery where a frightened victim died of a heart attack afterward, without having been struck or injured by the robbers. And take what happened to Lakeith Smith. When he was 15, he was robbing a house in Alabama with several friends, and one of them got shot. But he refused to plead guilty to felony murder for a reason that, when you hear him explain it to a reporter, is pretty understandable.
Can you tell me why didn't you take that plea deal?
I knew I ain't do it. Like, I'm not gonna cop out for no 25 years for a murder I ain't do. And the people who did it, they got free. Like,
You said the people who did it. What do you mean?
the police, they got free. Like, the one who pulled the trigger and killed them.
Yeah, his friend was shot by a cop, and yet Lakeith got 65 years in prison, which doesn't feel like justice, does it? And his mom sums up the absurdity of that situation pretty well.
He should have got the proper time for the crime that he committed, the burglary. and the stolen property. To 65 years on a young guy, 15, who didn't kill no one. Didn't kill no one and didn't shoot at no one. Alabama. Yep.
Exactly. I honestly couldn't say it better. In fact, at this point, I'd argue Alabama's official state motto should probably just be an entirely derogatory, yup. But while Smith refused a plea deal, many don't, and that's actually one of the big hidden ways this charge can send people to prison, because prosecutors can use the threat of a huge sentence under felony murder to get people to plead down to lesser charges. It's one reason why felony murder has been called one of those quiet drivers of mass incarceration we never acknowledge. And it is just incredible to find out something most people have never even heard of is propelling an issue as prominent as mass incarceration. It's like learning most heart attacks occur due to people chasing greased-up pigs for sport. Though that would at least explain why there's a fucking law in Minnesota against it. And while nobody knows exactly how many plea deals were obtained under the threat of a felony murder sentence, some who've taken one have since spoken out, like Kevin Reese. He pled to aiding and abetting second-degree murder after he participated in a robbery when he was a teenager and one of his accomplices ended up killing someone. And here he is explaining his decision to take that plea.
I had two choices. My choice was either go to trial. In a trial, according to felony murder, I wasn't going to win because the threshold to prove someone's guilt for felony murder is so low. Only thing they had to prove was that I was there, right? And it was, no fact, I was never saying I wasn't there. I was saying I didn't do it. And my other choice was take a plea for 22 years and go do 15 years in Minnesota correctional facilities. I had to rationalize this in my 18-year-old brain. I had to almost rationalize, okay, maybe somehow I deserve this. I had to literally say, well, and rationalize taking 22 years instead of getting life.
That is horrible. Because normally, when people are forced to choose the least bad option, it just means that they resign themselves to having lunch at a Cracker Barrel. Look, when you're on the highway and the other options are places like Sada IHOP, Mystery Meat Buffet, one-way ticket to the toilet, and homophobic Wendy's, then unfortunately, Denny's with Confederate vibes is gonna be your least bad option. But despite making the pragmatic choice, it had huge impacts on Kevin, both practical and emotional.
All of the programs inside of the corrections facilities, it's about cognitive, behavior, criminality, all of that thinking. So you be in spaces where you have to lead with, I am Kevin, I'm a murderer, right? You have to lead with that. But each time that I had to lead with that where I'm a murderer, it's really easy to get bitter, right? It's really easy to have a lot of distrust and disdain for the system in itself. And it also feels very much like being kidnapped. It feels very much like being kidnapped because the crime, what you did and why you're there, there's a disconnect, right? So each time you look at your paperwork and it says the big red M, murder on there, you cringe. I'm really here for murder. I'm really here for murder.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly frustrating. If they're going to reduce someone's life to a big red M for murder, the very least they could do is then add a smaller red, but, not literally, it's just a weird legal quirk. Just Google felony murder if you want to know the deal. Shit's insane. And since felony murder involves the US criminal justice system, you're probably already assuming it's applied disproportionately to non-white people. But the thing is, you'll be shocked to learn that white people are actually far more likely to face prison compared to, just kidding, of course it's applied disproportionately to non-white people. In fact, even within the context of the American justice system, the extent to which that is true is shocking. In New York, in cases where people were convicted of felony murder as accomplices, so where they were not charged with killing anyone, Hispanic people were about 12 times as likely as white people to be convicted, and black people were more than 34 times as likely. In Wisconsin, where black individuals account for less than 7% of the population, they make up 76% of those incarcerated for felony murder. And in St. Louis, a city whose population is slightly less than 50% black, every single felony murder conviction between 2010 and 2022, a total of 47 people, was of a black person. And very few things are 100% black people. Not even, as we now know thanks to Rachel Dolezal, the Spokane, Washington NAACP. But there's another group on which this law has disproportionate impacts, because a lot of the people you've seen so far were in their teens when their crimes happened, and that is not a coincidence. Young people are more likely to commit crimes in groups and are more impulsive than adults. In fact, felony murder has been described as the quintessential juvenile crime, capitalising on the developmental vulnerabilities of adolescents. That is why it sends a lot of people in their teens and 20s to prison, and often for decades. At one point in Pennsylvania, nearly 3/4 of those serving life without parole for felony murder were 25 or younger at the time of their offence. And look, there are certain places you do expect to find a teenager. A high school, an Olivia Rodrigo concert, in Matt Gaetz' texting history. But it is shocking to see so many locked in prison for felony murder. Just take Almir Nance. He was only 16 when he participated in the armed robbery of a Tennessee Radio Shack, during which another person shot and killed a store employee. Even though Nance was not the one who pulled the trigger, he was given a mandatory sentence of 51 years. And even one of the jurors from his trial was horrified when she learned about his sentence.
Do you remember how you felt when you heard this 51-year minimum sentence?
I was stunned, shocked. You know, a life was taken, and that is a terrible tragedy, a great injustice to the victim, to his family, to all the people whose the ripples of his life would have gone out to for generations. But taking Almir's life when he had just started it and wasn't even formed into who he was going to become yet, really, I felt horrified. And I feel like I followed the instructions, but the law wasn't just, and I regret being a participant in that injustice.
Of course, if you follow the instructions, only to learn that a teenager is getting sent to prison for half a century, that has got to be the worst jury duty experience ever, followed closely in a 1,000-way tie with all other jury duty experiences. So to recap here, felony murder is a law almost no other country uses. It harshly punishes people for killings they didn't commit, and it disproportionately impacts the non-white and the young. So what on earth is the argument for it? Well, some try to argue that it works as a deterrent against criminal behaviour. When Colorado was in the process of amending its felony murder law, this state senator strongly opposed the change.
Felony murder, just as a concept, ensured that people are not going to be cavalier about who they hang out with and what those people are doing.
OK, so a couple of things. First, maybe back up from your camera just a bit. And second, while it is nice to think felony murder could be a deterrent, there is little evidence of that. In fact, a task force in Minnesota concluded that the existence of the charge does not deter behaviour and does not reduce the risk of reoffence, which does make sense, doesn't it? It is hard for something to be a deterrent if no one knows about it. Think of felony murder laws like Apple TV shows. Sure, there are tons of them out there, but most people have no fucking idea they exist. Now, other supporters of the charge argue it's worth it simply to keep would-be criminals off the streets. Here is the sheriff who investigated Almir Nance's case, defending his 50-year sentence.
What would your response be to people who say, this isn't really working, locking people up, doesn't actually solve any problems?
Well, for those that say it doesn't really solve any problems by locking these juveniles up for a long period of time, Almir Nance hadn't been involved in any more violent crimes.
What? Well, you know what, by that logic, fuck it, just lock everyone up forever. And even as I said that, I've just realised that is definitely now going to be the official theme of the 2028 Republican National Convention. So what can we do here? Well, the solution is actually pretty simple. Just get rid of the felony murder charge. Every other common law country did that decades ago, and we should too. And to be fair, some states are at least trying to limit it. Minnesota changed its laws so that someone can no longer be charged with murder unless they intended to cause a death or were a major participant in a murder. And California did something similar, and both states made their changes retroactive, so people convicted of felony murder could ask to be resentenced. And thankfully, after getting media attention, some convictions have been overturned. The Elkhart Four had their felony murder convictions reversed, and the guy with the car keys had his sentence commuted by Florida's governor. However, Lakeith Smith and Almir Nance are still in prison. And if you are seeing a pattern here, congratulations on noticing extremely obvious patterns. And look, no one is arguing that people who commit a felony should go unpunished or that there shouldn't be consequences when someone is killed. But they should be punished for the crime they committed and not one they did not intend or indeed carry out themselves. Because as I hope you've seen tonight, felony murder really doesn't address crime at all. All it does is throw people in prison for decades for something that they often did not do. All of which really begs the question, what the fuck? And you know what? For this one time, I'll actually allow it.